Start with the wedding announcement, not the wedding. Before Linda Clapp married the heir to the Trump real estate fortune in January 1962, her future sister-in-law went over the wording and suggested she claim Columbia classes she hadn't taken. 30 years later, Fred Trump Sr. rewrote his will, and testimony indicated he still feared money reaching her. She'd been divorced 2 decades. The family that edited her out of one sentence in 1962 did not control the last version. Her 2 children opened the books, the courtrooms, and the archive. It began at a poolside bar in Nassau in 1958. That detail about the announcement comes from Linda's daughter, Mary Trump, who put it in print in 2024. And I want to be straight with you about the evidence before we go any further. Mary is not a neutral witness. She sued this family, she signed a settlement with them, she broke it, and she has made a career out of telling their story. Her brother, Fred Trump III, has written his own book, and the family denies large parts of it. So when I tell you what happened inside this marriage, I'll tell you who's saying it. But here's the thing about the announcement detail. It doesn't need a courtroom to be damning. It's small, it's petty, and it's exactly the kind of thing a family does when they've already decided somebody doesn't belong. The version most people know, to the extent anyone knows it at all, is a nice one. Airline romance, a stewardess and a pilot. He was handsome, funny, well-liked, the eldest son of a man who was quietly becoming one of the biggest landlords in New York. They met in the Bahamas. He drove a Corvette. They married young, had 2 children, and named both of them after his parents, Fred and Mary. That last part usually gets read as a gesture of devotion. Look at it again. They named their children after the 2 people who had already decided the marriage was a mistake. Linda Lee Clapp was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in 1939. Her family was not poor in a dramatic, cinematic way. They were poor in the ordinary American way, where everyone works and it's still tight. According to her daughter's account, Linda's father, Mike Clapp, had wanted to fly. He didn't get to. The Depression took the money and a family injury took the rest, and he spent his life as a hardworking man who was not especially warm about it. Linda's grandmother had taken in laundry to keep the household upright. So flying in Linda's family was the thing that got taken away from you. She didn't stay. She worked for a finance company, then as a long-distance operator, and by 1961 she had done what a certain kind of young woman did in that era when she wanted out of her hometown and didn't have a diploma to trade on. She became a stewardess and moved to New York. Small point worth flagging. The press has spent 60 years calling her a TWA flight attendant, probably because her husband later flew for TWA. Her daughter's memoir says she flew for national airlines. That's the kind of error that gets repeated forever once it's printed, and it's a useful warning about how much of this story is secondhand. The meeting was August 1958 in Nassau. She was 19. He was 20, a Lehigh student home for the summer between his sophomore and junior years, and by every account from that period of his life, from his friends, his fraternity brothers, and later interviews, Freddie Trump was the most charming person in any room he walked into. He talked about the new Corvette he'd bought with money he earned working at a Chevy dealership near campus. In Mary Trump's telling, that same car was later destroyed when his sister Mary Ann wrecked it in a car elevator. Even his good luck had a short shelf life in that family. Then he vanished on her. No calls, nothing. For a young woman in 1958, that's not a mystery. It's an answer, and Linda took it as one and went on with her life for 3 years. What brought them back together was an apartment. In 1961, she moved to New York for the airline job and needed somewhere to live near Idlewild, the airport we now call JFK. She got in touch with Freddie because Freddie's family owned buildings in Queens, and finding an apartment was the one thing he could absolutely do. He found her one. They started seeing each other. He proposed that same year. Understand what each of them was getting, because they fell in love is true and also not the whole account. Linda was 22, 1,000 miles from Kalamazoo, in a job that could be terminated by marriage or age, with no family money behind her and no degree. Freddie offered stability, affection, and a name that opened doors. That's not gold digging. That's arithmetic that any sensible person does. And Freddie? Freddie was getting a witness who wasn't from the family. He was the namesake, the eldest son. He'd been sent to St. Paul's, then Lehigh, where he joined a historically Jewish fraternity despite not being Jewish and ended up running it. A choice some later writers have read as rebellion against his father, though that's interpretation, not documentation. He did ROTC, took a commission in the Air National Guard, graduated in 1960, and stepped straight into the job that had been assigned to him at birth, working for his father. Linda was the first significant thing in his life that Fred Trump Sr. hadn't picked out, which is precisely why the family disliked her before they'd properly met her. Mary Trump has written that the assumption was immediate and fixed. Her mother was a gold digger who'd latched onto the first rich man she found. There's no letter in an archive that says this in Fred Sr.'s handwriting. What there is, decades later, is sworn testimony in a fight over his will, reported by the New York Times, that Fred Trump Sr. never liked Linda and worried that money left to his grandchildren would end up in her hands. That's not a memoir. That's a family explaining itself under oath. And it establishes something important. The suspicion wasn't a passing 1961 sneer. It was durable. It survived the wedding, the grandchildren, the divorce, and Freddie's death. And it eventually got written into a legal document. Keep that in mind, because everything that happens to Linda for the next 40 years runs through it. The warning signs available in 1961 were not the ones we'd list now. Nobody knew where the drinking would go. What was visible was structural. Freddie had no independent income. His job, his prospects, and eventually his housing all came from one man who had already made clear what he thought of his son's fiancée. Any woman marrying into that was marrying a household budget controlled by her critic. They were married on January 20th, 1962 in Fort Lauderdale. Now, that's not where a New York real estate family stages a wedding. According to Mary Trump's account, it happened in Florida for two reasons. It was cheaper, and Linda's mother used a wheelchair. Both reasons belong to the bride's side. Read that however you like, but notice what it means practically. The ceremony that formally joined Linda to one of the wealthiest families in Queens was scaled to what her people could manage and located where her mother could get to the room. And then the announcement. The wedding itself was small. The announcement was the part that went out into the world, and that's the part the Trumps took an interest in. Mary Ann, Freddie's older sister, is described as handling the details of how Linda would be presented, down to suggesting she mentioned coursework at Columbia she had not taken. If that account is accurate, and it comes from Linda's daughter, decades after the fact, then the family's first collaborative act with their new in-law was to improve her on paper. She didn't correct it publicly. She didn't correct much of anything publicly, ever. That habit is going to matter later, when she is the only adult in this story who never publishes a book. There was one more piece of the wedding that nobody made a fuss about at the time, because it was simply how the industry worked. Airlines did not permit married stewardesses. So Linda resigned. In the same week she gained the Trump name, she lost her paycheck, her seniority, her flight benefits, her apartment arrangement, and the entire independent life she had built to escape Michigan. She was 22 years old, newly married, unemployed by rule, and about to move into housing controlled by a man who was already counting. Their first son arrived that November, born in Manhattan, and named Frederick Christ Trump III. The following year, the young family moved into a building his father owned in Jamaica, Queens, the Highlander. Their daughter Mary was born there in May 1965. The geography of this is the whole story in miniature, and I'd like you to hold it in your head. Jamaica Estates, where Fred Trump Sr. had built the big house and raised 5 children, sat up the hill. It was white, comfortable, respectable. Down the hill was Jamaica, and on the edge of it stood the Highlander, one of the elder Trump's rental properties. That's where the eldest son and heir was living. Not in a house, in one of his father's apartments, a short drive, and an entire class boundary from the family home. Everything in that apartment came from the same source. The lease, Freddie's job, the salary, the doctors, if it came to that. Fred Trump Sr. was not an abstract patriarch making pronouncements. He was the landlord, the employer, and the bank, and he held all 3 positions simultaneously. Linda had no income of her own, no property, and no relatives within 700 miles. Freddie worked for his father in those years, including on Trump Village, the big Brooklyn development. There's a well-documented story from that period, his own brother has told versions of it, in which Freddie was dressed down by his father for installing new windows instead of repairing the old ones. That's the level of scrutiny. A grown man with a wife and 2 children being corrected on window budgets by a father who never let a compliment escape. One of Freddie's colleagues from that time said he complained that he never got any appreciation. Donald, years later, put it in the plainest possible terms in interviews. Their father could be unyielding. It worked for Donald, and it was never going to work for Fred. In 1966, the newspapers listed Freddie Trump as a vice president of the company. That's the public record. That's what a stranger reading the business pages would have seen, the heir ascending on schedule. That same year, he quit and went to fly for TWA. This is the decision that everyone in the family later treated as the original sin, and it's the one that tells you what Linda had actually married into. Because from the outside, a Boeing 707 captain for a major airline in 1966 is an enormously prestigious job. Pilots were glamorous. Pilots were the astronauts of commercial life. Freddie was good at it, and 3 men who trained with him later spoke about his ability, and Donald himself has said other TWA pilots would come by the house and that his brother had natural talent. His father called him a chauffeur in the sky. That line comes to us secondhand, through a friend of Freddie's speaking to the Washington Post in 2019, so treat it as recollection rather than transcript. Mary Trump's version of Donald's contribution is blunter, that her uncle told her father their dad was right about him, that he was nothing but a glorified bus driver. Again, her account, published in 2020, about a conversation she did not witness. But the pattern doesn't rest on either quote. It rests on what happened, which is that the eldest son of a wealthy family took the one job he was genuinely gifted at, and his family treated it as a humiliation to be absorbed rather than an achievement to be announced. Now think about where that leaves Linda. She had married a pilot. Flying was the thing her own father lost and never got back. It was, arguably, the single point of real alignment between her history and her husband's ambition, and the people upstairs on the hill were systematically taking it apart. It didn't last. By the end of the 1960s, Freddie's drinking had made flying impossible, and he came back to Queens and back to his father's payroll, doing maintenance work on Trump buildings. There's no gentle way to describe that trajectory. He went from the left seat of a jet to fixing apartments his father owned, and he did it in his early 30s, in front of his wife. Then came the detail that I think is the most quietly brutal fact in this entire marriage. Freddie tried to buy a house. He couldn't get a mortgage. Sit with the shape of that. His father owned thousands of apartments across Brooklyn and Queens. His father had built an empire substantially on federally backed housing programs. Government-supported financing was the family's native language, and the eldest son could not get a bank to lend him money for one house for his own children. Mary Trump's summary is that the family was effectively trapped in that run-down apartment in Jamaica. Trapped is the correct word for Linda's situation too. And I want to be precise about why, because she should have left is the question every viewer is silently asking. She had no job. She had no savings that were hers. The roof over her children was owned by her husband's father, the man who had never wanted her there. New York in 1969 did not have no-fault divorce. The law was changed that year and took effect after. She had no independent lawyer, and any lawyer she found would have been going up against a family with money, real estate holdings, and before long, Roy Cohn in the address book. Her own parents were in Michigan and Florida with nothing to offer but a spare room. And there were 2 small children in the apartment. What finally ended it, according to Mary Trump, was an incident she says she witnessed as a very young child, waking to find her father laughing while pointing a rifle at her mother. I'm flagging that hard. It is a memory retained from roughly age 2 and published nearly 50 years later by an interested party. The family has never confirmed it. What is not in dispute is the outcome. In 1970, Linda told Freddie to leave, and he never lived with them again. The divorce followed. Here is the part that reveals the system better than any rifle. In her daughter's account, when Linda put her husband out, she arranged for the locks to be changed, and the person she went to in order to make that happen was Fred Trump Sr. Look at what that requires. To eject the son, she had to petition the father, because it wasn't her door. It was his building. The single most assertive act of Linda Clapp's married life had to be routed through the man who considered her a gold digger, and he was the one who could grant or refuse it. He granted it. That's worth noticing too, and it complicates the picture in a way I don't want to smooth over. Fred Sr. did not defend his son. He also did not cut Linda off. Modest support continued after the divorce, enough that Donald would later be quoted in his niece's book saying the family had made a mistake continuing to support her and that she should have been made to stand on her own 2 feet. Mary disputes that anyone meaningfully supported them at all. The 2 claims sit side by side in the same book, and I'd argue they're both partly true. The money was real, and it was small, and it was conditional. Conditional on what? On her continued presence. Because Linda did not get to disappear after 1970. She kept getting invited to the family holidays. An ex-wife, divorced from a man the family had written off, still expected to appear at the big house on the hill and sit through Christmas. Her daughter describes finding her at one of these gatherings alone at a table, off in the dark, her face stricken. The gifts from those Christmases had become minor legend, and they're worth repeating precisely because they're so small. Mary Trump has described a leather-bound journal given to her brother that was 2 years out of date. A cellophane-wrapped basket of crackers and salami with the tissue paper still dented where a jar of caviar had been removed. A single gold shoe filled with hard candy. And for Linda, a handbag, a nice one, with a used tissue inside. Every one of those is a re-gift, and every one of them was handed to the poorest people in the room by the richest. I'm not going to pretend a used Kleenex in a purse is a crime. It isn't. It's something smaller and harder to prosecute. It's a family telling a woman, annually, in front of her children, exactly what her place was, while the invitation itself made sure she couldn't opt out of hearing it. She kept going. For years. And the reason she kept going is the same reason she'd stayed married. Her children's connection to that family, and their eventual inheritance, ran through those rooms. That inheritance was already being quietly rerouted while she sat at the table. Freddie's last decade is short to tell and grim to read. He lived apart from them. An apartment, treatment, and eventually the attic of his parents' house in Jamaica Estates. He did maintenance work on his father's buildings. At one point, he went to Florida and worked on boats. In 1977, Donald asked him to be best man at his wedding to Ivana, an honor Donald has since described as something he hoped would help. It didn't. On September 26, 1981, Fred Trump Jr. died of a heart attack brought on by alcoholism. He was 42. His daughter has written that no one from the family was with him at the hospital. That account has been repeated so often it now functions as fact, and I'll note, as I have throughout that, it comes from her, published in 2020, describing a night when she was 16. What is documented and public is thinner and, in its own way, worse. His mother, in a 1994 television interview with an Irish broadcaster, said only that they had lost their oldest son, that he was 41, and that it's something a mother never forgets. She got his age wrong. Linda was 39, divorced, raising 2 teenagers, with no career she'd been permitted to keep and no claim of her own on anything. But her children had one. When Freddie died, his share of the family's holdings passed toward them, a 20% interest in an enormous portfolio of New York apartment buildings. On paper, in 1981, Linda Clapp's son and daughter were heirs to a real fortune. 10 years later, in 1991, Fred Trump Sr. signed a new will. Donald helped with the drafting. It left the bulk of the estate to his 4 living children, with their descendants behind them. Freddie's 2 children, the son and daughter of the eldest son, the ones carrying his parents' own names, were left $200 and $2,000 each. An advisor reviewing it warned that this was tantamount to disinheriting them. Now here is the fact that makes this a story about Linda rather than a story about money. When the will was later contested, testimony surfaced, explaining the thinking, and the New York Times reported it plainly. Fred Trump Sr. never liked Linda, and he worried that money left to his grandchildren would find its way to her. Donald offered his own version of the same logic to the Daily News, that his father may have felt that if it went to the 2 children, it might also go to the mother indirectly. Read that again. In 1991, 21 years after the divorce, 10 years after Freddie was in the ground, the elderly patriarch of one of New York's richest families was still structuring his estate around the possibility that a woman he disapproved of in 1961 might get her hands on something. That is the answer to the title. Not the drinking, not the rifle. The disturbing thing about Linda Clapp's marriage is that it never ended. It converted into a permanent line item in someone else's financial planning. Fred Sr. died in 1999. His grandchildren learned what the will said and, in March 2000, went to Queen's Surrogate's Court and challenged it, alleging fraud and undue influence. The family's response arrived by certified mail on March 30th. Days earlier, hours after Fred Sr.'s funeral, in fact, Fred Trump III's wife Lisa had given birth to a son, William, prematurely. Within 48 hours, the baby had a life-threatening seizure. He was diagnosed with infantile spasms caused by a rare genetic mutation and would go on to develop cerebral palsy. His first year of medical care ran past $300,000, covered by the family's plan. The letter said the coverage would end on May 1st. Donald Trump was asked about it directly by Heidi Evans of the Daily News, and he did not dodge. When his nephew sued, he said, they asked why they should give him medical coverage. Asked whether that looked cold-hearted given the baby's condition, he said he couldn't help that it's cold when someone sues your father. In court filings, the family characterized the round-the-clock nursing as expensive babysitting and suggested Fred III take a Red Cross CPR course. Fred III's answer to the paper has stuck with me. He said you have to be tough in this family, and that he had what his father didn't. Then, these are not warm and fuzzy people. They never even came to see William in the hospital. A judge ordered the coverage restored while the dispute was pending. It settled confidentially in April 2001. Mary and Fred III took cash. A later filing put her figure above $2.7 million and surrendered the 20% interest they'd inherited from their father. They also signed a non-disclosure agreement. Which brings us to the only question left. Who got to tell it? For decades, the answer was the family. Donald built the accepted version himself, patiently, across interviews, in his 1987 book, in Playboy in 1990, in People in 2015, and in 2019 when he said he regretted pressuring his brother, that flying was what Freddie loved. It's a genuinely affecting story about a promising man ruined by alcohol told by his brother, and it has one consistent feature. Linda isn't in it. Neither is the mortgage he couldn't get, nor the will, nor the letter dated March 30th. Then the machinery reversed. In 2016, a woman who had spent her adult life on the outside of that family began handing boxes of documents to the New York Times. Mary Trump was the source behind the 2018 investigation by David Barstow, Suzanne Craig, and Russ Buettner into the family's finances, which won the Pulitzer Prize and demolished the self-made man story permanently. In 2020, she published her own book. Robert Trump went to court to stop it, citing the 2001 non-disclosure agreement, and failed. In 2024, her brother published his. Her second memoir that year was titled With a Question about whether anyone could ever love you. Not all of it worked. Mary sued in 2020 to reopen the settlement, and in 2024, Justice Robert Reed ruled that she had released those claims back in 2001. The money stayed where it was, but the record didn't. I want to be honest about what we can't know, because this family produced no archive of letters, no foundation, no preserved correspondence, only lawyers and books written by people with a stake. We don't know whether Linda loved Freddie at the end or forgave him, or what she thought sitting at that dark table on the hill. She never wrote a memoir. She never gave an interview. When the Washington Post came looking in 2019, she declined. Even the basic facts of her later life are contested in the public record. She had a lifelong habit of not correcting things, and she took it with her. So go back to that wedding announcement in January 1962. A 22-year-old from Kalamazoo, about to lose her job because the airline didn't allow married stewardesses, hands over her details, and her fiancé's sister goes through them and improves her, suggests she mention a school she hadn't attended. It's such a small edit. It's also a complete statement of the arrangement. You may join us, on the condition that we write you. They wrote her for 60 years. They wrote her out of the announcement, out of the apartment lease she never held, out of the will, out of the story Donald told about his brother, out of the room where the medical coverage was canceled. The one thing they never got to write was the ending. The woman they kept editing raised the two people who obtained the documents, filed the objections, forced open the surrogate's court file, and handed the family's tax records to reporters. Fred Trump Sr. spent his last years making sure his money would never reach Linda Clapp. He was so busy guarding the money that he forgot she was raising the witnesses.